Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. In this session, we are going to talk about business email compromise on Microsoft 365 with focus on detection engineering for your SOC. What we are going to cover, we are going to talk about BC attack flow for financial fraud. We are going to delve into some example there. In addition, we will talk about common attack techniques and ways to identify them, new forwarding rule to an external address, over permissive access on mailbox folder, mailbox access delegation to Azure applications, and more. There are a lot of material outside about attack techniques and hunting opportunities in 365 environment. But in this session, we want to put a spotlight on the detection engineering side and talk about correlation and enrichments. We will show impactful available correlation and enrichment that can be achieved by leveraging session ID, app ID, mail item access event, and more. So who we are? My name is Eliraz Levi, and together with me is my dear colleague, Ophir Kelman. We both are security researchers at Hunters. We work together on developing detectors and also provide context and enrichment that can assist the analyst to investigate leads that these detectors generate. So Microsoft 365 is one of the most common SaaS applications for enterprise worldwide. It includes well-known common services we all know, like Exchange Online, SharePoint, OneDrive, Teams, and much more. Business email compromise is the main and common threat in the 365 environment. According to the FBI annual report, the total financial loss from business email compromise is around $3 million per year. This is more than $7 million per day. These numbers are reported to the FBI in the US alone. The actual number worldwide is probably much, much higher. Having said that, it's not a surprise that more than 60% of organizations are ranking protection against BEC attack as one of their top 5 cybersecurity concerns. So how $3 billion disappeared? Let's see a short example. So we start with a threat actor that gains access to a developer mailbox. This access can be achieved via phishing or access to a credential that were leaked from some third party outside there. In general, developer's mailbox is very interesting, but in this case, our attacker wants to focus on financial fraud. He wants to monetize the foothold that he already achieved in the network. So he is moving forward to the next target. He leveraged the developer's credentials to conduct an internal phishing and gain control over the mailbox of the personal assistant of the CFO. The personal assistant has delegation permission over the CFO mailbox. This is a common practice in many organizations. And now, at this point, the attacker was able to get to the point he wanted from the beginning. He has access to a C-level account that deals with the financial aspects in the organization. Now, the attacker starts to sniff around and explore the ways money flows within the organization. His focus in the correspondence between the CFO and one of the bookkeepers in the finance departments. In addition, he can try to exfiltrate some data via OneDrive using the credentials of the CFO, and also modify settings to allow smooth interception in the future. For example, he can manipulate folders permissions like inbox, RSS, etc., and also creating forwarding rules, inbox rules, and other. Now, the attacker starts to intercept in the correspondence between the CFO and the bookkeeper. He creates a fake email in the name of the CFO that asks the bookkeeper to change the bank account details of a subcontractor he should forward money to. What happens if the booker will ask questions, will return with replay with questions about this request? For that, the attacker is creating and modifying the settings that will allow him smooth interception. So, for example, if the booker will ask some questions, there is an inbox rule that the attacker created that will forward every email from the bookkeeper to and that come to the CFO mailbox. It will forward it to, for example, the RSS folder, which is less visited by mailbox owner. Then it will give the attacker an opportunity to examine the email, see if it reveals the fraud, and if it doesn't, it will move it to the inbox mailbox of the CFO. If it reveals the fraud, he won't move it and keep with the fraudulent correspondence. At the end, the bookkeeper received the request to change the bank account details of the subcontractors, and actually he moved money to the new bank account details, and these new details, what a surprise, are not the details of the original subcontractors, but the details of the attacker. So how we can hunt for such an attack flow? So we can divide this attack flow into two phases. First phase is the initial access, how we gain control over user accounts and by that over receive access to their mailboxes. The second phase is the post-compromise. What are we going to do after we gain such an access, and how we are going to change settings and gain persistency? So there are different ways to hunt for both phases. For the first phases, for the initial access phase, we can try to look for brute force, password spraying, impossible travel, and more. We will use it using two data sources. The first is the Azure sign-in events, and the second is a workload under the Unified Audit Log. Originally, it was called Azure Active Directory, but nowadays it is called Microsoft Entra ID. As for the post-compromise, we can use, again, different hunting methods, like looking for exfiltration from OneDrive or SharePoint, look for creation of new suspicious inbox or forwarding rules, look for abuse of e-discovery, and much more. For that, we are going to use different and various workloads under the 365 Unified Audit Log. We will look at OneDrive, SharePoint workload, Exchange Online workload, and also Security Compliance Center, which provide us events on e-discovery activity. So let's dive into some of the mentioned hunting techniques. A new forwarding rule to an external address. So here we want to detect the creation of new forwarding rule to an email address outside the organization. For that, we will look at operations, set mailbox, new inbox rule, and set inbox rule. These operations can run via the GUI, while the user will configure it manually, or it can be executed via PowerShell, like in this example. Here we can see the set mailbox command. The focus is the identity of Jon Snow. This is the target mailbox, the mailbox we want to forward emails from, and the destination address, the email address to which we want to forward the inbound emails. In this case, the threatactor@gmail.com. Similar thesis exists for transport rule while looking on operations such new transport rule and set transport rule.
Eliraz,
Yes.
one might have a question about that. Is there a difference between a transport rule detection and forwarding rule detection?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Set mailbox and the new inbox rule and set inbox rule, this operation ends in forwarding rule and inbox rules, and this can be created on the mailbox by the end user. Transport rule, however, can be created from the admin stream, from the 365 admin center, and they are related usually to activities conducted by IT admin and not by the end user. So usually attackers tend to leverage more the forwarding rule and the inbox rule rather than the transport rule because it's more easy. You need less permissions in order to configure that.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
So we talked about the set mailbox event. Let's look how this event is looking. So the operation is set mailbox. We can see here the email address to which we want to forward the emails. We can see also the session ID. We are going to elaborate about it later on. And also the user ID. So look at the user ID structure. This is a string that includes some names, so we can assume this is the mailbox of a user called Jon Snow, but it's very hard to work with such a field while conducting and executing comprehensive threat hunting and incident response investigations. We would like to have a more structured and clean format, like, for example, email address. But for some portion of set mailbox events, as well as other events, we won't get it in a clean and neat format, but we will get something like that. So how can we overcome it and get a more clear user ID field? We can do it by correlating the set mailbox event with other event called user logged in. How are we going to correlate between them? We are going to use session ID. And after the correlation, we will be able to extract valuable fields like user ID and user agent. So let's see how it looks like in the user logged in event. So we look at the user logged in event and we can see the session ID. Please notice that this session ID is equal to the session ID we saw here. So this allows us an accurate correlation. And now we gain some interesting fields. For example, the user agent, which might be very interesting in some cases, and the user ID. And look, here the user ID is in a very structured format of an email address, and it's much more convenient to work with this event when the field is in this format. Another advantage we can get using a correlation is when we try to leverage the sign-in activity event. So we will try to correlate between the user logged in and the sign-in activity. How are we going to correlate? We're going to use the inter-system ID field in the user logged in event and correlate it with the correlation ID in the sign-in activity. Although these two fields have different names, the meaning is the same and we can correlate between them. What we gain out of it? We gain very cool information that exists in the sign-in activity event, but doesn't exist in the user logged in event. We get the geolocation data and also information about the authentication method and procedure. Let's see how this data is look like in the sign-in activity. So we can see, first we can see this is how the Azure sign-in activity is look like. We can see that we have a correlation ID. Please note that this correlation ID is equal to the inter-systems ID here. This is what allows us the correlation. We can see the original username, and we can see data on the on the way the authentication has been conducted, for example, MFA in this case, and also on the geolocation.
Eliraz, it's me again. Why are those details important? Why is the geo information, also the authentication info is important?
Yeah, that's a good question. So at the end, we want to understand if the original operation, the set mailbox operation, was legitimate or malicious. So we need some context in order to have a good verdict around that. So one of the attributes and the information that can assist us in order to gain this context is the geolocation and the way the authentication was conducted. So for example, if we see the country from which the original authentication happened, if we see the country is an unusual country, it could raise our confidence that this is a malicious or potential malicious activity. In addition, if we see that the authentication procedure didn't use an MFA, so it also can raise our confidence that this is a case of an account takeover.
I understand. Thank you.
Yeah, so these are ways to enrich our understanding of what happens and get raise our confidence whether it is a legitimate access and activity or not. Another correlation we can do using the session ID, a very cool one, is to look at the session ID that was used for the set mailbox and correlate it with other operations that were conducted around the time frame of the set mailbox activity. For example, if the attacker has downloaded file from OneDrive or SharePoint or manipulate mailbox folder permissions, if we see these activities in the time frame of the original activity, this can give us more contents and understanding of what have happened. On the Hunter's SOC platform, we provide this information out of the box. We provide it under, for each lead, we provide it under the activity section. Based on the session ID, we look on all the operations that were conducted on the same time frame and present them. So here in this example, you can see that the operations that are presented are new inbox rule, enable inbox rule, and when we can open it into a table and see the exact time they were executed and some other important details. So there are many ways to correlate between events in 365 environment. And the challenge, and sometimes this could be very confusing and challenging because some of the fields are not exist in all the different schemas, in all the different data sources and workloads. And even if they exist, some of them have different names. So the following table is kind of a summary of the different ways to conduct an effective correlation. So for example, the Security Compliance Center, we can see here the user ID, but we don't have here session ID. Another example, and this is a kind of a problematic because the Security Compliance Center workload, we use it in order to investigate e-discovery events. And if we want to correlate e-discovery events with other events, we don't have the session ID, we need to use only the user ID. Another example based on this table, what happens if we want to correlate between, for example, set mailbox operation under Exchange and some Azure sign-in event. So the session ID exists under Exchange, but it doesn't exist under Azure sign-in. What about correlation ID? Correlation ID exists under Azure sign-ins, but it doesn't exist under Exchange workload. So how can we correlate? So like we saw in the example, we can try to correlate the session ID from the Exchange with the session ID in the user logged in under the Azure Active Directory workload. Then we can use the field that exists under the user logged in event called intersystem ID, and from there correlate it with the correlation ID field existing in the Azure sign-in. That way we can correlate between the Exchange online event to the Azure sign-in event, although we don't have a common field for the two of them. So to summarize, we can say it could be confusing, but this table can be valuable for that. It's important to remember that best practice is to correlate based on two fields, username and session ID. And in any way, we should be aware of the different options because it could be very useful during threat hunting and incident response investigation. So next, we are going to delve into some more examples. And at this point, I want to pass the torch to my colleague, Ophir.
Thank you very much, Eliraz. Let me share my screen. So, hello everyone. I'm Ophir, Eliraz's colleague, and we have two detections ahead of us. The first one is about over-permissive access grant on mailbox folder. Let's talk a bit about that. Whoops. All right. So if we remind ourselves of the attack flow Eliraz mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, we can recall that at some point the attacker managed to establish his presence on the CFO mailbox. And at that stage, this detector is relevant because the attacker might want to establish persistence or have another way of accessing the folder. So he might add additional permissions for a certain mailbox folder. The data source we're using for this detection is Microsoft 365 Unified Audit Logs. The operations used for that are add mailbox folder permission and set mailbox folder permission. We don't look for write access named availability only and limited details because they are related to calendar access rights. We also only look for cases where the granted user is either default or anonymous. Default is used for internal authenticated users, and anonymous is used for external unauthenticated users. The attacker might use either one of them, depends on how he wants to access the mailbox folder or where he already has presence in the network. We can see below the command line an attacker might use to add such permissions. Here he uses add mailbox folder permissions for Jon Snow mailbox, specifically for the inbox folder, for the user default, having owner access rights. So here we can see an example query for such detection. This is Snowflake query, and we can see the fields we extracted under the select section. Most of these fields are used for actual information about the event, but many of those, such as user ID and app ID, session ID, are used for correlation and later context adding. Eliraz already mentioned many ways to use user ID before, and in the next slide, we're going to talk about using application ID for adding context. In the predicates in the where section, we can see the details I mentioned before, which operations we're looking for, which users are relevant for this detection, and which access rights are not relevant for it. It is important for us to exclude as many events as possible which are not included in the thesis we're trying to detect. This is for reducing the amount of false positive alerts generated into the SOC queue for the analyst using it. So in the original event, we have app ID, but what we don't have is app display name. And the app ID by itself doesn't tell us much. You can see by yourself, but the app display name might add a lot of context, give us clues about what happened here. So here we can see the application is Microsoft Exchange REST API based PowerShell. And tools such as PowerShell or command line interface are less likely to be used by a legitimate user and more likely to be used by a malicious actor. So this is important for us to know if this event was generated using such an application. But how do we do that if we don't have it in the event? So again, we want to correlate. Specifically here, we have two methods of doing that. First method is using Azure sign-in logs. We're looking for the app ID in the Azure sign-in logs and try to find the matching app display name. If we fail and we can't find such a match, we have a fallback for looking at the Microsoft documentation, which is essentially a table of app IDs and app display name.
Ophir?
Yeah.
It's very cool that we can extract the application name from the app ID, very useful. But what about applications that are not related to Microsoft's built-in application? For example, applications that were created by users.
So that's a good question. We will try to find a match in the Azure sign logs, even for non-Microsoft, non-built-in applications. And we might find a match here. If we don't find a match here, the analyst will have to do a manual check using the Azure console or another events in the data sources he has.
Yeah.
So
it's more challenging, but still available.
Exactly. That's a good point for understanding the value of what we can automate, because when we can't, it costs us time and effort.
Yeah, sure thing.
So here we can see an example of such an alert. Specifically, this is from the Hunters portal. We're from Hunters, so we're showing you our solution. But of course, any detection engineering solution that automates and correlates and follows the principles we mentioned will suffice. Here we can see the user default was granted with access to a folder of Jon Snow's mailbox. The operation was initiated by testo1 from the source IP. We have all the details we wanted of the alert directly from the query, and most interesting thing here is we have an enrichment telling us that Office 365 operation was executed from either PowerShell or command line interface. And this is valuable for whoever is reading the alert because it helps us either dismiss or escalate the alert faster. In this case, maybe escalate because it is more likely to be a true positive, a malicious act. And this is, as I mentioned, is done automatically and saves a lot of time of doing manually all the stuff I mentioned before. So pretty cool, if you ask me. Moving on to our next detection. Our next detection is mailbox access delegation to Azure applications. A threat actor can leverage Graph API to access mailboxes. You can see the UI of it on the right side of our screen. The detector detects granting of sensitive API permissions to Azure applications, including but not limited to mail read write. We can see how it looks like in the UI, pretty simple. Adding such sensitive permissions requires admin consent, so we're talking about an advanced stage in the attack chain. The data source we use for this is Azure Audit, and the operations we look for are add delegated permission grant and add app role assignment to service principal. So here we have another example of how an alert looks like in this detector. And we can see that the role read and write mail in all mailboxes was added to a service principal mailbox backup app by the user test01. And we have all the details we need here. So how can attacker access mailboxes using Graph API? First of all, he needs a few credentials. He needs the application ID. We can see here we have an application called Mailbox Backup App. Looks a bit fishy. We have the tenant ID, and we have the secret of the application for it to be able to access mailboxes. Having those, we can write a PowerShell script, such as you see on the screen, which essentially does three things: connecting to Graph API, targets mailbox details, and then iteratively read emails. We insert the credentials we need: client ID, tenant ID, and client secret. We specify which folder we want to read for what user, and then we can see that the script outputs a file for each email it reads. This PowerShell script requires two modules, msal.ps and Microsoft Graph.email. Moving on. So here we can see an event called mail item accessed. This is a special event relevant only for E5 license for the mailbox having the license. And we have few interesting fields here. First, we can see two fields for app ID. The first is app ID, and the second is client app ID. The second, if we recall, looks like the ID of our mailbox backup app. Next, we have a section called folder items. We can see we have internet message ID in them, and it looks like an identifier for an email. I can tell you that this includes all the emails accessed by in this event. And also, we can see we have different sizes for different emails. We can also see that the client request ID is similar for all those. So that's helpful too. It is also possible to view which path the emails were found in, here specifically in inbox. We have the mailbox owner, test05, which is where the emails are read, the operation, mail item access, and we have a field called operation count. This is an aggregation or a count of all the items accessed, because Microsoft helps us and aggregates those actions, because they might might amount to a lot, and it's easier to view it this way. Lastly, we have the user conducted the action. Here it's test 05, but it doesn't have to be the same user.
Ophir?
Yeah.
Regarding the app ID and the client app ID on the top left side, could you please elaborate a little bit about the differences between the two?
Sure. That's a good point. So we have those two because when we think about it, we have our local app, our client app, which then uses the Microsoft Graph to access the emails. So this clarifies or gives more detail exactly what happens. We have the app which actually read the emails, and then we have the app on the client side that initiated it. So essentially, this gives us more details about what exactly happened here.
Cool, cool. Actually, it gives us great visibility into the way the attacker used the application, if I understand correctly, use the application with the client app ID, and then this application used the app ID in order to actually conduct the activity on the mailboxes with the Graph API application. That's very cool.
Exactly. If you remember, the permissions were given to the app ID and not to the client app.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Very cool.
And also, I might mention that this specific event is very interesting and very important for investigation because this enables us to see which emails exactly were accessed. Without it, we wouldn't know. And if we have an incident and we need to investigate what exactly happened, this is essential if we want to know the content of what was accessed.
Yeah, very, very important artifact from forensics aspect.
Exactly. So we're almost done. We managed to get to the summary of our presentation. We had our business email compromise attack flow for financial fraud beautifully described by Eliraz at the beginning. It was a possible logical flow of how an attack might be laid. Later on, we delved into the attack techniques and hunting opportunities. Specifically, we chose to show here 3 detectors. The first one was new forwarding rule to an external address. The second one was over permissive access grant on mailbox folder. And the third one was mailbox access delegation to Azure applications. Each one of them, we also included correlation and enrichment, which were ways to add context because, as Eliraz mentioned, this presentation emphasized the detection engineering part of Office 365 security. We mentioned how we can leverage session ID, app ID, mail item access to either add context and understand better what happened or have more information which wasn't available in the original event. Thank you everyone for watching, and thanks for the great Eliraz.
Thank you. Thank you for joining. So hello everyone, we are in the questions section. I will repeat some of the questions that were asked via the chat and even answer one that I didn't answer yet. So does hunters have out-of-the-box detectors for these suspicious and malicious activities? So As for the out-of-the-box coverage for the suspicious activities, all the techniques mentioned during this webinar are covered by Hunter's platform. We also provide the potential enrichment and correlation we outline. For instance, convert app ID to app name, display other operations with the same session ID to get more context, and also other correlations. And we provide it out of the box as part of the relevant lead page and the associated entities. Another question, continue of the next question, of the previous question is, are there any out-of-the-box detectors hunters have for OneDrive? So, as for OneDrive, we have a detector for possible exfiltration. We look for high amount of file downloaded events in a short time period in the light of a baseline we create for the organization during the learning period. So this is a statistical mechanism. And this is for possible exfiltration. As for abnormal access and sign-in to OneDrive, for that we have several detectors around identity theft, mainly based on sign-in activity event and user logged in event. And we have a password spraying detector, a brute force, impossible travel, anomalous login, unusual login, etc. So this is for that. Another question, when it comes to the logs from PowerShell, do we need to export these logs from an endpoint? PSL, PowerShell logs from laptop or server, or these logs can be exported as part of the API calls in Azure and Azure AD. So this is a really good question. So when the API command is related to Azure, so we most likely see this event as part of the unified audit log. So we don't need a local auditing. But if it is a general PowerShell command that may relate to the malicious activity, but it's not a direct API related command, it's not, it doesn't use the Azure API, then it won't logged as part of the Azure Unified Audit Log. And for that, the PowerShell logs can be very useful, mainly to add more context and understanding of what the threat actor has done on the infected machine or on his machine. So that's the answer for that. So if I need to summarize it, so in the logs under Unified Audit Logs can give us quite a good understanding of what happened, mainly when it comes to the direct comments on for the Azure tenant, but they can't give us the full picture of what the actor had run on his machine. Let's see if we have another question here. No, I see no more questions. So thank you everyone for joining. I hope it was valuable and effective. And please reach out if you have any more questions in the future. So goodbye and thank you.